Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me today. And this episode has been heavy on my heart for a couple of weeks now, and just trying to think through a concept that I found to be comforting and mindset shifting that came to a head in this last couple of weeks. So I have a very, very close friend of mine who, since she was in her early 20s, has been estranged from her father, and had heard, I'd say, 6 weeks ago that he had fallen ill and wasn't doing well and was living in a nursing home. And amongst everything else that she's kind of handling in her life, had thought about the idea of whether or not she should reach out or reconnect, or what that would look like, kind of the risks and benefits of doing so. And anyway, but before anything actually happened as far as any contact, she got an email from her father's brother or her uncle saying that he had passed away. And I had the opportunity to, have a dinner arranged with her ahead of time, and got to kind of walk through all of the emotions that would come from that news. And one of the things that I found helpful was really examining kind of her reaction versus their reaction. And what she told me is, it was very interesting because her instinct, and she actually ended up doing this, was to go and put a care package together, or like a basket, and sent it to her family. And she said it just felt very natural. Like, she cared about that part of her family. She had maintained connections with some of the uncles and cousins, despite her estrangement from her father. And at that point, she felt like she wanted to support them, because they had lost somebody that they cared about and somebody that was important to them. And it wasn't until after the package was mailed that she kind of reflected and thought, well, isn't this weird? I'm the daughter, the only daughter, only child, and yet I'm the one comforting them. And what we talked about, and what I wanted to kind of develop today, was my thought that really what you're seeing here is that she had what I would term a completed relationship with her father, 30-something years ago. That relationship had run its course. It had come to an end, and it was, for all intents and purposes, a neutral word. It was completed. There was nothing more to that story, right? There was no other communication or connection to add to that. And what I was thinking was that the people that she cared about were just now, at this point in 2025, experiencing a completed relationship with him. And that got me thinking, just in terms of, there's all sorts of different types of completed relationships I can think of, and different reasons why relationships may be completed. And if you stop yourself and you say, well, that's not what relationships should do. They should never complete. They should all just continue forever and ever. And, somehow a completion is bad. And I would argue to you that I'm sure, if you've got some years on you, that you can go through some relationships that followed a natural course. Maybe they completed voluntarily or involuntarily or whatever. And that we're all only living in whatever relationships are yet to be completed. And that changes over time. So that very, very best friend you had in high school, or in your early adulthood, or that mom that you bonded with, when your kids were in primary school, whatever that is, there's sort of a seasonality or a phase to that relationship. And it's normal and healthy for you to not keep every single relationship you've ever had. Now, of course, going into it, you don't think about that necessarily. You're like, oh, how is this relationship going to complete? But, relationships do come and go. There are a couple of relationships that you might be able to think of, obviously, with your family members or in your marriage, maybe a long relationship with work. You plan to work there for 30 years, something like that you anticipate going longer, but that doesn't always happen. And I think one of the things I enjoyed talking about and using this concept with my friend is it just felt very neutral. I mean, obviously, this is a very heavy topic. Can you imagine, right? This is a decision or an event that happened 30-something years ago that she thought about all the time. And even more so recently because of the news that she had gotten that her father was sick. And what I really thought was healthy about this concept is it both acknowledged the gravity of the situation, but also made it in a tangible way that you could really kind of manipulate the words and the concepts around to actually approach them versus it being like, oh my God, I can't deal with this. So when I started coming up with reasons that relationships complete, I started realizing they pretty much all start with a D. So that was convenient because, I like to have things that are alliterative or work well with acronyms. But anyway, so let's start with the first and most obvious one, which is death, which is what involved the second completion of this relationship, I guess, for her and for her family. And for the most part, that is something that's not anticipated, although it's 100% guaranteed in a lot of relationships, unless there's something going on medically and everybody has a lot of warning. Death is a very natural way for a relationship to complete. Now, I would put an asterisk by that because a lot of people have experienced positive, healthy relationships even after the death of somebody else or because of the death of somebody else. And in fact, if you've ever listened to Martha Beck, who's like a prolific author and kind of self-help guru, she has an incredible explanation of what happened to her in her relationship with her father, who she described as abusive and had a really malignant relationship with him, that it was only after he passed that relationship actually improved and that she came to feel his relationship and his presence and his support after the fact, which I won't get into it. I don't want to steal her words, but I remember where I was when I first heard her describe it because I'd never heard it described that way. But what she talked about was there was so much tension in that relationship because of what had transpired. And which I'm sure a lot of people deal with is, oh, should I visit? Should I not? Should I reach out? Should I not? But if I get in communication, it might be malignant. It might be abusive, just another opportunity for me to be abused or disappointed, et cetera. And so not having that hang in the balance anymore actually allowed some freedom for her and some really better reflection without the fear. And what she did was kind of take the best versions of him, the best memory she could have of him, and then created opportunities in her mind and in her life to, I guess, feel his presence. I don't want to get too far into it, but it is a really interesting description of it. And so I say completed, and a lot of times when I say a relationship is completed, and in many ways, none of these are final. Like there will be some other version of that relationship, even in death. That version of that relationship is your relationship with the memories of that person. And that's why it's so incredibly important when you are here and you're available to make connections and memories with the people that you care about. One of the reasons to do that is because if either of you slips away, then that allows that person to have a lot more things, right, in their head and in their body and in their spirit that they can connect with you on. And they might see, I don't know, a movie that you watch together or drive past a place that you like to visit. And all of those things you get to reconnect with. And to the extent to which that relationship was healthy, positive, loving, or warm, that person can re-experience those feelings, maybe in a bittersweet way, but continue to re-experience those things and throughout their lifetime. So I'd say completed with air quotes. Okay. So I don't know. And many versions of however you think of the afterlife and many versions of them, it's not really a completed relationship. Maybe that version is the best way to think of it. That version of that relationship is now complete. And you can think about this in stages, right? So with a child, you might have that version of that relationship when they lived with you, or that version of that relationship before they got married, or that version of that relationship before they started driving or whatever. Like there are different iterations of it. And I think a lot of us kind of move through these completions and starts of different relationships or different phases of different relationships without even thinking about it. And you might reflect on, hey, something feels different, something feels weird. But really life is just a series of this, right? So completing and restarting and completing and restarting. So going back to the story with my friend, it was helpful to look at the relationship she had with her father that ended in her early 20s and look at that as a complete story. And we talked a lot about not characterizing the entirety of a relationship given the complexity of human beings with the way that it ended. And this is a big thing for me. And I've talked about this before on the podcast, and just it has very ever present to me in my life that I would not want my worst version of myself or the worst decision I've ever made to define an entire body of work in a relationship. Now, of course, you can think of things that should be relationship ending, and I'm not saying there isn't an appropriate time or place to complete a relationship. But for me, going back and recognizing even relationships that ended poorly or that in retrospect were unhealthy, that there's still some complexity there. There's still some positives and some things that you can think back to the very best version of that relationship, and you still can own that. Like, of all the things, if you're going to have to go through so much trauma or so much terrible experience with this person, at least keep the things that were amazing, right? It may be weird to think about that. If it's your relationship with that person, you get to make whatever you want of it, right? You don't have to listen to me. I'm just going back and kind of recognizing the complexity of how it feels when it ends is not completely explained by the circumstances unique to the ending part of that relationship. There's probably a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's probably, in most relationships, some mix of really great times and really horrible times. And so upon the completion of that relationship, it can stand alone, and you don't have to necessarily judge the relationship by how it ended. I have a lot of relationships that I think didn't end well or didn't end voluntarily or however this worked, but I don't go back and kind of tell myself, well, the whole thing was for naught, right? Or the whole thing was a waste of time, or the whole thing, whatever. I mean, at any given point, I'm just making the best decisions I can with my time and my relationships. And sometimes they're good decisions and sometimes they're bad decisions. But anyway, so death as the first D, if you will, a natural completion to a relationship, at least that phase of that relationship. And obviously, in many cases, unpredictable. Another one is distance. And we can talk about geographic distance again. And this is the same friend that just moved across the country, and that's been hard, right? That relationship that we have is now in a very, very different phase. I just don't see her as much. We don't talk as much. We don't text as much. We used to pretty much see each other every weekend, and that's not happening. And so I'm still figuring out, just with that specific friend, that geographic distance has done a lot to change the character of that relationship. And it takes more effort to maintain that relationship. And so I'm still kind of figuring out what that means, even in this case where she loses a parent. I'm lucky that she happened to be in town and we happened to get to talk about it and had some opportunities to explore all these complex ideas. But that was just happenstance that she happened to be in town for a work trip. And so anyway, so distance geographically can be, anticipated or unanticipated, right? Maybe somebody has to move for work or something else happens economically or who knows. But there's geographic distance, and then there's also just, contact distance. Like maybe you still live in the same city or you live a block away from each other, but then there's just some distance emotionally. Maybe you just have less time. Maybe you're prioritizing different things. But either way, distance, whether geographic or emotional, can also create, sometimes subtly and unintentionally, the end of or the completion of a relationship, at least that version of that relationship. And again, I'm not saying this in some prophetic way that somehow once a relationship is completed, it can't be revisited or restarted. I mean, I think everybody's had some instance in their life where they thought that they would never see that person again, or they get reconnected, or, something random puts you in contact and you realize, you really got along, whatever. But yeah, so distance can be another one. And I should go back and kind of revisit this in the context of aging parents. Obviously, death is the completion of that relationship, and something that a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to avoid and control and mitigate all the causes or hastenings of death. But the next one would be, putting increased distance emotionally or geographically is something that you have to kind of overcome in supporting an aging parent. And that involves a lot of big decisions like moving and proximity and so forth. And I know we've kind of labored that point quite a bit in the podcast before. The other one, again, with the Ds, this is kind of interesting how it turns out this way. And I'll put these two together. It's kind of disease and disability can complete a version of a relationship. And I say that because, especially if there's a cognitive disease or disability, that person may change just enough to where the contents and dynamics and even the underpinnings of that relationship have shifted just enough that it basically is characterized by a new dynamic or a new relationship. And I've heard a lot of people talk about this, like, that's my dad, but that's not my dad, or, that's this version of my mom is not one I'm familiar with. And you can see that there's a lot of tension in the work to get them back to where they were before. And that's where I kind of come in. That's sometimes I'm in part of this phase, and I think that that's valuable and important work to try to return somebody to a prior version of themselves. But as you can imagine, a lot of cases of disease or disability, that's really challenging, if not impossible. And so sometimes I'm witnessing somebody fighting with the new version of their parent, with their newly acquired disease or disability. And it's a weird thing to watch because there's a loyalty and dedication that I see from the child, the adult child, who is loyal and dedicated to the previous version of this patient. And I just saw this past week, and what it can manifest as is like, I've had, family members in the gym kind of yelling at the patient to try harder, to push farther, and to not give up. And the therapist come tell me, this patient is shaking. Like, she is literally trying her best. I think she weighs all of 97 pounds. And she has been through hell and back and has fought through unbelievable disease and disability. And there's still this push, right? And some of it can be familial dynamics, could be cultural, but there was we actually had to rarely have to do this, an intervention to try to get them to back off a little bit. Like, they are like, you don't understand who she used to be. And that's what they'll tell me. Oh, you don't understand. She was doing this, she was doing that. And I'm like, well, at this moment, this is the version of her that we are trying to help. And if we push her too hard, we are going to make her go backwards or fall, or something bad's going to happen. So when you're introducing disease and disability, what people feel is that a previous relationship has completed. A previous version of that person has completed without their consent. Nobody asked them and called and said, okay, can mom go to the hospital with a heart attack or a small bowel obstruction or whatever it is going on. That just happens. And it's almost like that tension of well, this was involuntarily. Nobody asked me if this could happen. And a lot of that energy gets pushed back into pushing that person back to who they were. And again, I am not trying to discourage people from encouraging other people, but it feels different. I can hear it, and it's almost like I can feel the pressure is, we are not going to accept this version of you with disease or disability. We are just going to really, really go hard in the direction of trying to make sure that you get better. And, anyway, it ends up being a very interesting, difficult dynamic at times to navigate. Okay, another D that I have seen kind of complete relationships, and this one's really quiet, and that's just drift. And I mentioned it maybe in emotional distance, maybe it's very similar, but drift happens, and drift can happen to almost anything in your life. You can drift away from a hobby, you can drift away from a person, you can drift away from, any kind of connection. And I see this when people get really busy or they get a new job or, it just happens. It's just a practical zero-sum game of life. There's only so many minutes in the day and so much attention that can be given to different things and so many resources. And so drift is sort of, I feel like, the insidious, maybe slightly voluntary, slightly involuntary thing that will complete a relationship, but not in an explosive way, in a very quiet, kind of backdoor type way. And I'll tell you, this is the one that probably affects me the most with my parents, and specifically with my dad. I'm not sure if he listens to this podcast anymore, but I feel drift all the time. And it's weird because I'm very close to my dad, but I can also go 4 to 6 weeks and not talk to him, which is weird. Or try to reach out to him. And he's still a pretty busy guy. He's still works, and he's got a girlfriend now, and, likes ranching type stuff. And I never make it mean anything oh my God, something's wrong with my relationship with my dad. It's just a very easily drift relationship. And of course, when we get back together, it's like nothing happened. I mean, nothing did happen, but do you know what I'm saying? It's just this weird thing. And I feel it a little bit with my mom. I'm luckier. I live a lot closer to my mom. And when I start to feel that, I can reach out and go over to her house or go out to lunch. A little bit harder with my dad, kind of just the way that his lifestyle is. And so, Yeah, drift to me, I'm always trying to be aware of it, and it bothers me, and I what I don't want is drift to turn into distance, and then I end up missing something, or being too far apart, but that's something I always gotta be aware of, and I can do that in my own, like, my own life too. I drift away from the gym or something else. I know before, like, a lot of my career changes I made several years ago, I started to feel that internally, like, there was this drift that was happening, like, my attention, my presence was not the same, and I could it was that part almost felt involuntary, like it was just this a parting of the ways, I guess, pineapple. Like the slow parting of the sea that just starts small, but at the end of the day, it's like Moses, like the whole Red Sea is parted. So anyway, drift can sneak up on you, and I think drift can be good. You can notice it and be like, you know what? Like, I'm just really that's not a good situation for me anymore. That's not a good relationship for me. And maybe drift is good. Maybe there's some good functional part of why they're drifting. Maybe that's your body or your life's way of saying, like, that's not something I can be investing in right now. Or you could use it as like a little yellow light, like, hey, wait a minute. You don't want drift to become distance to become completion, right? Kind of thinking of it that way. Another way that I think relationships complete is disagreement. And I don't really like that word, but I had to go with a D. So disagreement as in just conflict, right? I mean, going back to the beginning of this podcast, talking about what my friend went through with her father, a very private and personal disagreement, but a catastrophic one is the best way to characterize it. And yeah, so disagreement, arguing, and that to me is a very personal judgment as to what level of disagreement or what content of disagreement warrants what kind of completion. And I come into that like fanatically non-judgmental. You will never hear me say, "Oh, that wasn't enough of a disagreement to do that," or "Are you kidding me?" Like that happened and that person still talks to that person. I regard that as so incredibly personal. It's like your underwear drawer or something. Like, I am not going to ask or get involved or make any judgments about this. To me, it is totally up to you. And all of those things are valid. That is a very personal decision. But ending a relationship over a disagreement or conflict, to me, that's really hard. There are some parts of my family, it's weird, just to talk about kind of my own little microcosm. There are some branches of my family, weird, unrelated, two different parts of my family, where disagreement and conflict characterizes almost every completed relationship, right? To the degree of like, if you do a family tree, all of these different limbs and twigs are cut off for all of these various, reasons. Now, maybe, okay, I said I wasn't judgmental. There is a point at which when you are alienated from 90% of your family because of very different beefs at very different points in time, maybe there is something weird going on there. There is a point at which I would wonder if I looked at your family tree and it was that cut back like a machete for different beefs with different people over different periods of time, then I would start to wonder maybe something is going on there. But anyway, so I have these basically two parts of my family on both sides, unrelated to each other, that does just a way of life, that they get crossed, they feel crossed, and that person is dead to them. They don't even mention the person again. They don't participate in anything. They end up, I'll tell you what it ends up like, because I've seen it happen over a period of decades, is their lives get very, very small. And maybe that's the point, right? They don't have to deal with anybody else, but they just cut people out. Hardcore, right? It happened once. Somebody cut out their own son. Like, and it's weird because at the same time, and these are people, by the way, interestingly enough, married into my family. None of those are like blood related to me. These are individuals that kind of brought that culture into the family and practiced it in their nuclear family. And then on the opposite side, there are people in my family that would, like, there's nothing that could end that relationship. Like, it's almost like my grandmother had this saying, like, nobody could be in conflict. That was always her thing. She would meddle and she would be like, it was a deep, deep thing to her that nobody be in conflict in her family. And so there was a lot of hush hush. There was a lot of maybe like half truths, right? But it was always a thing to not tell Nana if you were like having some issues, because that was going to really, really affect her viscerally and deeply. But anyway, and so there's those two parts of my family, and then the rest of my family, Like, it would be unheard of. Like, you couldn't, I don't know of any pragmatic way you could cut somebody out like that, right? Like, it just doesn't even, like, it wouldn't even be accepted by the larger family. Like, it just doesn't happen. Family is everything. Family is very important. You're very loyal to your family and you get through stuff. It would be like a mark of shame to be estranged in some parts of my family. And then other parts of my family is like a mark of bravery. But like, the idea is like, I just live in this world where like, I can't even imagine being estranged. And part of that is also because my family is so large and so local, it would just be hard. If it was like, hey, yeah, I was in a small family, I'm an only child, and I live, 5 states away. I mean, that's not that hard. But when you see each other pretty frequently for weddings and funerals and birthdays and graduations and all that stuff, like, it's just kind of hard to maintain that level of completion or conflict. So anyway, so disagreement and conflict, I think it's a natural course of being a human, right? And the natural course of many relationships that kind of get through some and some that don't. And that often leads to things like divorces and separations and oh yeah, if we didn't even talk about divorce, that's the other D. See, I knew it. All the D's. Anyway, so for conflict and disagreement, I think that's a rough place to be with an aging parent. And I just want to hold some space for if that relationship is characterized kind of just throughout the relationship with conflict and disagreement, it doesn't seem to get that much better, as they age. Now, what's funny is there are some neurological conditions, such as head injuries and strokes, that can change someone's personality and sometimes change them for the best. And I have a patient like this right now whose daughter came and told me, you know what? She was like the worst before this happened. She was so mean and so awful to us and so said so many mean, terrible things as just a version of who she was. Like, that was her normal organic state. And now that she's had this stroke, she's actually very kind and considerate and funny and understanding. And so we were kind of talking about it. And I said, hey, take what you can get, man. Like, but rebuild some relationships, call in, the relationship cavalry here and like do as much as you can, because once she starts to recover neurologically, you're going to start to see some of those traits come back. And so we kind of talked about this as a unique window to try to connect and experience a different version of her mom. So anyway, so conflict and disagreement, that can be really challenging. That can go explosively. That can affect multiple people in a family. We won't get it. Maybe we do a whole other podcast on kind of conflict de-escalation, but there's some skills there and there's some work that goes into that relationship of either avoiding conflict or addressing conflict when it comes up, not just between the adult child and the aging parent, even between the siblings, right? That can come to this. So, okay, I said I was going to talk about divorce. Yeah. So again, another completed relationship, or at least that version of that relationship. As I've talked about a lot on this podcast, my parents have been divorced for, I think, 12 years now, maybe. Yeah. And they have a different version of the relationship. Luckily, I think it's healthier than it was at the very beginning. And luckily I have good parents and they have prioritized, their kids and their grandkids and those relationships, even though it was difficult or hard at times. And we get to have that completed relationship. Like, me thinking about my childhood, it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. Even though that relationship to me, when the divorce happened, it was a very challenging and acrimonious and difficult time for my family. It's important to me to not let that characterize the relationship that completed at that time, that I get to still experience myself as a child with parents that cared about me, that lived together, that, built us up together, that developed us together and supported us. And the way in which that specific relationship ended does not characterize, and I've, again, worked at this, characterize the existence of the relationship than 99% before that. And that's important to me. That's important to me to keep that intact, because that, to me, feels healthier, because it recognizes the complexity of humans. It recognizes the complexity of relationships, and it recognizes the non-zero chance that relationships come to an end one way or the other. And that once a relationship ends, or at least that version of that relationship, one thing you can key into, well, what does the next version of this look like? And that can be as a result of any of these things, right? So once my friend moves, What does that look like? So that looks like me planning more trips to Washington, D.C. than I've ever probably done in my life or anticipated doing. Or after disease and disability, what does that look like? Maybe that looks like putting some grab bars in the bathroom or getting a vehicle that's easier to get in and out of, something like that. Or drift. If I'm noticing drift, then, what is that alerting me to do? What's my next step? What is that kind of the tickler for in my head or in my life to move forward? And then in disagreement and conflict, what are the lines? What are the things that are going to potentially complete a relationship? If that's not what you want, then what are the stages or skills or communication that's happening at that moment to try to preserve that relationship in that current form? So anyway, I would encourage you to maybe go back and think about some things that are heavy, whether it's the end of a romantic relationship or a business relationship or a career choice or a version of yourself, I would say. I mean, there's completed versions of me, right? Like one of my friends just had a baby, like literally, I'm in my early 40s and my friend just has a newborn, and it's been weird because I've been like, I can't imagine having a newborn, and there's no part of me that would want to be having a newborn right now. And I'm very, very happy for her, but it has made me really starkly understand, like, that is a completed version of myself, the version of myself that is having children, or getting pregnant, having a newborn, having small children is done. Like, I'm like thinking about teaching my daughter how to drive and talking about college. It's weird. But anyway, so you can have all sorts of completed relationships, even in yourself, right? And I really like that way of talking about it. To me, like I said, it feels tangible, it feels neutral, and it feels to me like, okay, that's completed, and what's the next step? What's the next thing that's going to happen there? So anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope that you can please share the podcast. I'd love for more people to tune in. And please, please, please do leave a review, Apple or Spotify, or wherever you listen. Until next week, thank you so much for listening. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or two, sometimes three, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.